was this last weekend. It kind of had a lackluster main event. This was Thiago Santos versus Magomed Ankalaev, and this was like, just a back and forth, like, two guys that are really big that can tell, like, hey, if I land big on you, you're gonna get knocked out most likely, and you could tell that that's kind of how they were fighting. It's kind of how a lot of Santos's fights have been since getting injured. He's been a lot more kind of hesitant. Um, and I don't know if how much of that is the injury, or he also has just been facing the toughest competition that he could face. So it could be partially due to that. There was a time, I think it was the second or the third round, where Santos clipped Ankalaev, and it was towards the end of the round, and it looked like he was gonna finish him, but then the round was over, and then Ankalaev was able to win pretty much every other part of the fight. And it's funny, like I understand if you're looking at it from a fighter's perspective, and like you can use the same kind of argument for people that don't like to see wrestling or any kind of grappling in MMA. It's like if you go into a fight with someone that has the ability to knock you out with one punch, how are you going to fight them? Are you going to fight them to their strengths, or are you going to fight them to your strengths? And I think a lot of times, like, people get on this, oh, he's nut hugging, and I don't want to see a lay and pray type grappler. And it's like, dude, put yourself in their shoes, and like, this is a mixed martial arts, so it's multiple forms of fighting. Like, you're gonna fight and win the way that you can. You do what it takes to get the win. At the end of the day, 10 years from now, people aren't going to remember that this was a lackluster main event. They're going to see the record, and they're going to see who won. And so, like, and I also, like, I understand these big dudes, sometimes they're hesitant to throw, and I get that. Like, if you're facing a dude that any punch that he lands can knock you out, you got to kind of be careful. Obviously, like, as fans, we want people to throw caution to the wind and just let's throw bombs at each other, and hopefully someone gets a knockout. And like, as a fan, like, that's tons of fun to watch. But if you look at it from a fighter perspective, it's like, that's probably not the smartest way to watch, or not the smartest way to fight. Like, the best way to fight is the way that you feel confident that you can win. So in my opinion, it was just kind of the main event didn't perform as much as I wanted it to. It's funny because, like, some of these events that end up being lackluster, they get talked about as like, oh, it was just a high stakes chess match. Like, first of all, this is fighting. It's a funny analogy. Like, it's a high stakes chess match. Like, they're being really technical, and like, it's like, dude, there I could understand there are certain fights where you could say that, like, two really high level strikers that don't really kind of get things going right away. Like trying to think, like, the Rory McDonald Robbie Lawler fight, for example. That fight tended to be like slow in the first couple rounds, and then it turns out to be like one of the best UFC fights ever. And so, like, a fight like that, maybe you could say those couple rounds were more of a chess match. But like, just to say, like, oh, it was a chess match, technical, high stakes chess match, just because they're fighting and because it's a boring fight, I think that's a boring excuse. Like, I'm not here to put blame on any fighters. Obviously, I'm not the one getting in the octagon, so I'm not here to judge you on how you fight. I'm just, saying this from a fan perspective. Like, the fight was lackluster, but I also, like I said, I understand why it was lackluster, and I'm not here to put blame and say, oh, Santos should have gone out there and started throwing more shots and maybe got encountered and got knocked out, and same thing for Ankalaev. So that's just kind of my take on it. But outside of that, like, this was a super fun card. You had Song Yadong. He also fought Marlon Moraes. He got a TKO in I think it was the first round. I know it's been a couple days since the fight, but to me, this is the saddest part of MMA. And really, any sport that you watch, your favorite athletes, they go through their prime of their career, and then usually you see a drop off. So, like, I'm gonna use a basketball analogy. Like, or we could even talk football. But like for example, Dwayne Wade, my favorite basketball player growing up. This is a guy who was like, you know, one of the best players in basketball, like top five guy, MVP candidate. He wins a few rings with LeBron, and then he just kind of takes a huge step off. Like you could tell that it's something that, like he lost something athletically. And sometimes you still get a performance like where he drops 25 or 30 or something, but it's clear it's like this is not the same guy who was a top five guy in the NBA. He's not that good anymore. It's just an age thing. And with MMA, it's the only time where we see a professional athlete go from that peak that we remember. Like and the thing too in MMA is the peak is so much higher, because like in other sports it's like you win a Super Bowl or you win a championship in basketball. Like those are really good accolades, but they're not the same as being in an octagon with another human and knocking them out cold and winning a championship belt. And like, so I think that's what changes in MMA is then we see like these guys that come in and, they're really fun to watch. Marlon Moraes is one of them. Incredible striker and always fun to watch. And then, they go on a string of losses. This guy, he lost to Marab, Rob Font, Corey Sandhagen, and now Song Yadong. And he's losing to like really good competition. I think he lost to Cejudo as well. But he's losing to like the top of the division. But it's also like it's sad to see like these guys that are guys that you watched for years that you're a big fan of, and then instead of other sports where you see them kind of like take a step back and they're not that same level of athlete anymore on the field, and it's not like that sad. It's like in this case, instead of just them not performing as well as they used to, they're getting knocked out and they're getting brain damage. And like this is I don't want to see Moraes continue to get knocked out in other fights. Like I wanted to see him kind of get back and get a win. And it's sad seeing this happen to MMA fighters, but it also happens to boxers if they fight long enough. And it's part of the sport, so I understand that as well. But it also looks like at the end of the fight, Marlon Moraes took his gloves off in the octagon. I don't know if that necessarily means that he is retired. I would say there's a good chance that he is. I definitely don't want to see like one of these other. I feel like a lot of times these other organizations will pick him up, and then what happens with a UFC fighter when they're old is people want to see them thrown against the young guys and added to their highlight reel. Like Song Yadong is 24 years old, and the UFC is going to probably be using this clip of him getting this knockout for the next 5 years at least. So it's like I get it. Like if you're the UFC, like he got a big win over a really good decorated guy, but it's also like don't continue to fight when that's what's gonna happen. Like you're being thrown to the wolves. Like I'd rather see these guys like, especially if they're not like competing for a belt anymore. Like if you're in a Derek Brunson position like before his last fight, and you're like on your path to fighting for the belt, then that's one thing. But if you've dropped a bunch of fights, like Cowboy, for example, and like you're continuing to fight these young up and coming guys that are hungry to get these wins, it just doesn't make sense. It's like I'd rather see you matched up against another guy who's in the same boat as you, and then maybe you guys can both finish your careers on a better note, or maybe you get the win and then he fights another time and tries to get another win. Like I think that's a lot better than seeing your favorite guys getting knocked out. But that's just my take on it. I know Moraes, since he lost, he didn't really get much attention for taking his gloves off in the octagon. And also, like, he wasn't the main event either, so they don't always let these people get enough, like, time because they're trying to move things along and whatnot. But besides this, Sodiq Yusuff and Alex Caceres, this was a fun fight, too. It was interesting. Like, there's not a lot of fights where the majority of the fight is won by leg kicks. And Sodiq Yusuff, he landed over 50% of his strikes to the legs. So 34 leg kicks out of 64 total landed strikes. And basically what this did is just completely battered Alex's leg. Alex wasn't able to kind of initiate any grappling because of this. He was just working off of one leg. So he wasn't able to get the win, but it was a fun fight while it was going on. And then the fight before that, Khalil Roundtree Khalil Roundtree had a brutal finish on Carl Roberson. He goes out in the second round and like it's just something switched. Like he goes out and he's trying to kill. Immediately throwing bombs. He drops Roberson and then he has like one of those crazy soccer kicks to the body. It's something we don't see a lot in MMA, because usually like you don't kick or knee your downed opponent, but to the body it's different. Like he couldn't have done that kick to the face, but he landed it to the body, and he got just a crazy finish. He is a ton of fun to watch. He's going in these fights and just he's hurting people. Like he's one of the scariest dudes in MMA in my opinion. Like his last two finishes, one of them, he stomps this dude's knee out. And then this last fight, he just gets this crazy kick to the body, win, and like he's putting people out. He's super dangerous to watch, and it's definitely fun. I'm curious to see kind of where he goes next. And then before this, so a couple other super fun fights in this card. Drew Dober and Terrence McKinney. That was like the round of the year thus far. This fight starts off. Terrence McKinney goes in there and looks like he's just gonna put Dober out immediately. He drops him in the first 5 seconds, and I'm like, oh my gosh, is Terrence McKinney gonna get another 7-second knockout or like even close to that? And it looks like he is. Like there's multiple times he lands a bunch of big knees, good strikes with the hands. He landed a head kick even when Dober was getting up, and Drew Dober just keeps going through it. He doesn't get put out. There was a couple times where it looked like maybe the ref could stop it, but Dober hangs in there. And then towards the back part of the first round, he lands a big knee on Terrence's chin and then drops him and finishes him on the ground. And so, like, that's a huge win for Drew Dober. That was an incredible fight. You got to give props to Terrence for stepping in on such short notice. He took this fight, I think, on 2 weeks' notice, and he just fought last month. So he's still a guy I think is going to be super dangerous. Obviously, like he cut weight twice in a relatively short period of time, but he looks to be like a really dangerous contender, especially if he can kind of get beyond the first round. If he can settle in the fights and not like try to rush everything. And it seemed like he might have got a little tired, rightfully so. Like it looked like Dober was about to be put out, and Terrence was throwing everything at him, and somehow he wasn't able to put him out. Like I think that would happen to most people in that situation. But another thing that was fun about this is Drew Dober called out Bobby Green, which I think would be a ton of fun to watch. I think that could be like maybe even like a main event of a ESPN card. Otherwise, that's a really fun fight you could add to a pay-per-view even. And then the fight before this, Alex Pereira versus Bruno Silva. This fight was a war. Like, and I'm curious because I hear a lot of different things online. Like people look at this fight and they're like, Pereira couldn't hang on with Izzy at all. Like he doesn't even belong talking about fighting Izzy. What is going on? Like people are like discrediting the fact that Bruno Silva is a legit fighter. Like I think he was on a 5 to 7 fight win streak where all of the fights were finishes, and like this fight was crazy. Like they were both throwing bombs at each other. Pereira he definitely has a really fun style to watch. He throws a lot of kicks and he's got some crazy power in his hands. And he got the win. But like, I'll be the first to say like what's happened since he beat Izzy in a fight that like Izzy probably was like ahead on before getting knocked out. Like Izzy has done way more in MMA. Izzy is the champion and he's lapped the division. So to act like this guy's gonna come in and smoke Izzy is crazy, especially when he hasn't fought a ranked contender or a ranked opponent. But also on the same token, like to say that this fight is proof that he can't fight Izzy, I also disagree with. I think there's a middle line where I want to see Pereira fight someone in the top 15 and then, move up the ranks. And if he moves up the ranks and he beats these guys, like he'll have a track record that will be much more deserving to fight Izzy. And also, like, I want to see him against a guy that's going to grapple much more. I know they said that Bruno Silva's a black belt, but I don't think he's ever actually got a finish in a fight by submission. They've pretty much all been knockouts, which is still super impressive. So, I mean, I think this fight kind of raised both of the guys' stocks. Alex Pereira called out Jared Cannonier after the fight. That fight makes no sense. He's saying he thinks that it's okay for him to call him out. Like, um, I mean, if he were to have had like some kind of spectacular KO and then he wants to call out a top ranked guy, like, cool. But Jared Cannonier is going to fight Izzy for the belt most likely this summer. So, like, that fight makes zero sense. And the only reason Alex Pereira wants that fight is because if he were to beat Cannonier, then he's in the title, like, immediately. But in reality, like, he should move up the ranks. He should fight a guy from 10 to 15. If he wins that fight, fight another guy. Like, depending on how spectacularly you win these fights, you can move up the ranks. But that's just how I see it. There was actually a couple good fun fights on the prelims as well. The Matthew Semmelsberger fight versus AJ Fletcher. This was AJ Fletcher's UFC debut. It's a guy who was undefeated. And this was a really fun fight. You could tell Semmelsberger is the veteran of the game. Fletcher, like, I mean, the pace of this fight was crazy. They were both high-paced grappling, throwing a bunch of bombs. It looks like Semmelsberger had a little bit more power in there. But Fletcher looked good. He looked really good in the first round, and then the second round he kind of got flipped on the ground. He wasn't able to take him down consistently like he had hoped. So that kind of changed the fight, but that was a really fun fight in the prelims. And then the Javid Basharat versus Trevin Jones, super fun too. Basharat stood standing most of this fight. And he was just picking Jones apart, just so fluid with his strikes. And then Jones also showed that he's got pretty good power too, so he was trying to, fight back, and it was a really fun fight to watch.